Okay, in terms of stuff, as always, just bad news. Deadlines, slight change. There's some problems with Blackboard. So I bumped exam 2, quizzes part 3 back to June 17th. And so if you've done them already, I didn't go and like delete them. But if you haven't got them done, finish it June 17th. Exam 3 deadline June 17th. Exam 4, quizzes part 4, exam 5, June 18th. For the paper, if you want to do a draft, you can drop that off during office hours, drop it off in class, drop it off by drop envelope. And as soon as I get to it, I'll get it back to you. If you did a draft, dropped off a draft today, I've got all 3 of those done. They're here. If you want to get the +5 points, be sure to upload it to Blackboard by June 11th. For full credit, June 15th, and for half credit, June 18th. Grades will go in on June 19th, so be sure to check your grades and stuff, make sure there's no problems the 18th, and I'll put out an announcement on Blackboard the 19th, like in the morning, saying, final grades going in soon, check your grades, and then I'll put like another in like an hour ahead of time, final grades going in an hour, and I'll say final grades going in, and if you find a problem, be sure to let me know before that. Because if I find a problem before then, I can fix it, after them, problems. Before pressing on to the new stuff, anything about the stuff to be or previous stuff that needs more stuff? Okay. We now proceed on to our final part of philosophy class, part 4, looking at value stuff. So this part, we'll be looking at value theory, beginning with sort of what people typically think of when they think of a value, namely ethics. Then we'll take a look at aesthetics, what is all about the art and the beauty, and then go on to the final part of the introduction to value, looking at social and political philosophy. So that's the upcoming stuff. Now back in the ancient days of part 1, we saw stuff about what is ethics. And the basic idea is, bless you, ethics is about good and evil and all that stuff. And in moral philosophy, the objective basically is to sort out the various problems, work out moral theories, and we saw some of the classic moral problems and questions. And these range from the very abstract ones. We saw the idea of, back in those ancient days, we looked at sort of the levels of abstractness in ethics. And we saw, one version is descriptive ethics, which is merely describing the ethics of a particular people at a particular time. So we talk about, say, the ethics of America in the 1950s, and we contrast it with the moral views today, say regarding issues like same-sex marriage. That'd be descriptive ethics. We're not doing moral theory, we're just saying people thought this then, and people think this now. So talking about their moral views. And that's doing things like, descriptive ethics is doing things like anthropology, sociology, psychology. You're not, making moral judgments on people, you're merely saying this is what they claimed or thought. Again, the levels of abstraction, we saw, back in part 1, the various levels. And of course, it's still the same. The most abstract level is, of course, the meta level. And that's a level which deals with the most broad theoretical questions in ethics. Things like, what is good? What is evil? Is morality objective or subjective? Those highly theoretical problems and questions. Next level is the normative level. This is the level of building, principles, rules, etc., but not applying to particular cases, just so it's more concrete than meta, but still at a fairly general level. So working out general moral principles here. So, for example, moral theories like utilitarianism, which we'll look at, deontology, would be kind of here. I mean, they do try to answer the big theoretical questions, but they're also offering us guidelines, like the categorical imperative, the principle of utility, that type of stuff. Normally think of ethics, though, we generally work at the applied level. That's when we take our principles, rules, etc., and, shockingly enough, apply them to particular cases. So if we address the question whether or not, say,
stem cell research is moral or immoral, the applied ethics. Or if we're looking at the question of whether genetically modified is morally acceptable or not, also applied ethics. Now, when doing ethical stuff, we of course want to engage in assessment, because morality and value theory is all about judging stuff. And when it comes to judging, basically the following factors. We look at the actions, what is done. We look at the consequences, what results from these actions. We also look at, when we're dealing with people, we look at their motives, why they're doing what they're doing, and we also look at character, namely the sort of person doing it. So it's kind of like, well, it's almost like a description of a crime. What was done, what effect did it have, why did the person or persons do it, and what sort of people are they. Now, in some cases, all four of these factors all are, roughly put, it's all like consistent, all good or all bad. For example, if you have someone of good character, a kind and compassionate and generous person who is acting for their love for human beings, they donate, food to people that are hungry, and the consequence is that people who are hungry are no longer hungry. In that case, we probably say that's all good. Then, of course, on the side of evil, you can have like the total evil, four-way evil. You can have someone who's villainous in their character, they're greedy, violent, angry, you get all the classic 7 deadly sins going on. And their motives are awful. They're motivated, say, solely by greed, rage, anger, vengeance, all the bad motives. And they do something like awful, like they murder someone. And the consequence is bad, for the family of the person that's killed, etc. And so you'd have like the total evil deal going on there. Now what is perhaps, but perhaps not more interesting, are cases in which these factors are kind of, blended, where you have not everything, evil or not everything good, but some things that may seem good or may seem bad. For example, could there be a case where someone of very bad character, for all the wrong reasons, does good stuff that has good consequences? Well, one example might be this. Imagine, if you will, a company. We'll call it evil company, because evil is always hiring. They have good dental. And suppose you have like an evil CEO. So they have bad character. They have no compassion, or very little compassion, motivated primarily by greed, anger, and racism, and so forth. So they're kind of a pretty bad person. And their motive is basically, their drive motivation is greed, not a desire to succeed or be wealthy, but just straight up pure greed, in the biblical sense. Now, the person obviously bad character, bad motives, but interestingly and boringly enough, they may take actions that we might regard as good that are good consequences. For example, if the person is running evil company and they're motivated solely by greed, they would look at the situation, if they're rational, they'd say, well, if they act on, say, their racism and sexism and horrible, character, then they'd end up getting in a lot of trouble, lawsuits, and that would wipe out the company. So what they might do is have very enlightened, hiring, retention, promotion policies, and as a consequence, their company may employ lots of people who otherwise would not get employed at many other companies. And so out of, say, terrible motives, just pure greed, a very bad person who's racist, sexist, etc., could, out of the motivation of greed, have enlightened hiring policies that create a lot of good for people. So a perfect villain doing good things for all the wrong reasons. Now, of course, you can also have blending in which you have, say, a person of good character with good motives does something that ends up having terrible consequences. For example, back when they were working on a vaccine for polio, because polio was pretty bad, definitely don't want to get that. And you could say, you know, the doctors, you could say they're probably a good character, good motives, wanted to help people, and they were, you know, testing the vaccines. Now, the way vaccines work in different ways, but one sort of common way to create a vaccine is to have like a dead virus, essentially. Well, if that makes any sense, because we're not really sure if viruses are truly alive, but one that's been like killified. And what they do is basically take the virus corpses and inject them into you. So you're injected with dead viruses, which is kind of creepy. But then your body, your immune system finds it and kind of looks at it and says, hey, what's this nasty stuff? We'll remember this next time. So when that shows up again, we'll know what to do. So they learn the way of the virus. Now, the disadvantage, though, of having the killified virus is it doesn't really super fire up the immune system. It's just like, oh, this is dead crap, let's clean that up. And they also tried what are called attenuated or weakened viruses. These are crap analogies, like they kind of punch them a little bit, rough them up and, you know, hit them with some sticks, and then inject them into the person. Now, the downside of attenuated viruses is that they're attenuated, they're not killified, to use the, you know, of course, technical medical term of killified, which means the viruses may actually be able to cause the disease. And what happened is that some of the people who were, you know, testing the vaccine, you know, in the experiments, the children, got polio from the polio vaccine, which is horrible and ironic. So you have people of good character, trying to, you know, doctors trying to help the kids, good motives, but it had terrible consequences. And so you can have people for all the right reasons doing things that turn out badly. And people, you know, everyone's heard the expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That kind of fits in there. Person have good motives, good character, but lead to terrible things. And of course, people of good character can have bad motives. They can become, you know, angry about things, enraged, and do something terrible. And when judging people, we generally take these into account. And again, as I mentioned, it kind of looks like a breakdown of, you know, in a way, a crime. When judging, we look at what was done, what effect did it have, why did the person do it, and what kind of person is this? And if someone's like a good character, and their motives are understandable, and even if the action was bad, we might be more forgiving, you know, because we consider a person's why they did it, etc. Interestingly, importantly enough, to close this bit, most moral theories tend to pick like one of these things to focus on. For example, we'll look at utilitarianism, which is the view the way you should do is what creates the great, or roughly put, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And so they focus on consequences. And so actions themselves, you don't have moral worth, it's the consequences that really matter. We'll look at Immanuel Kant, and he rejects the whole notion of consequences and focuses primarily on motives, and he claims that actions are good or bad in and of themselves. And so also, as a final example, folks who buy into what's called virtue theory believe that character is the main thing. So those are kind of four ways to judge things. The action itself, good or bad. Consequences, good or bad. Motives, good or bad. Character, good or bad. Now, in order to kind of score these things, we need a point system. Anytime you're doing like an assessment or evaluation, you gotta have like a scale of value. Now, fortunately, generically, the scale is really in a way not a scale. It's got like two parts. There's what's called positive value and negative value. And of course, these can come in varying degrees. But, put kind of generically, positive value is pretty self-explanatory. It's something that has, to be circular, positive worth. Yeah. To use some examples to illustrate it, in the case of, say, money, positive value, if you're running a business, would be making a profit. You're running in the black. Or positive value in the case of like aesthetics would be like beauty, because that's considered something that has, you know, a worth. Now, of course, in ethics, we measure positive value by the term good, right. Now, switching to the negative, reversing polarity, negative stuff are things that not only lack value, they're actually a loss. To use the example in business, going the red making a loss would be negative value. In aesthetics, we consider such things as like, ugliness or negative qualities that are bad in aesthetics. In the case of morality, straightforward negative value would be evil. So positive is stuff that has worth. Negative is stuff that lacks that and is actually at a loss. And again, value can be anywhere. It can be in ethics, measured in good and evil, in economics, measured in money, profits and loss, and it could be in aesthetics, measured in beauty and ugliness, etc. So value can be many sorts of things. Now, there's also two other kind of modes of value. And it's something that philosophers debate about, and so do people in economics, or anywhere where there's value. And here's the two concepts: intrinsic and extrinsic. Extrinsic I'll start with first, even though I wrote it second. Here's the idea. Something has extrinsic value means that it's valuable as a means to something else. That it's valuable because someone, or many someones, places value upon it. One way to remember this is, extrinsic. Think of it as like external. It gets its value from outside. For example, if we look at things that are like means to an end, like medicine. The reason why we value medicine is not because we go, yay, medicine. If we were, if we were superhuman and never got sick, we would not value medicine because we wouldn't need medicine. If we similarly like similarly like food. If we didn't need to eat and we didn't get any enjoyment from food, then we wouldn't value food. Another example is money. Money's worth is extrinsic because it's worth something, because it's a means to an end. You can take money and you can get stuff you need, like food or medicine. Also things like diamonds and gold. They're valuable because we value them. If we didn't value them, they'd be worthless. Now money, of course, is a good illustration. Money's value derives from the fact that we value it. And you can take, to illustrate this, you can take kind of like a post-apocalyptic scenario. You could go like zombie apocalypse, Walking Dead. And one thing you might have noticed if you ever watched like the Walking Dead or the classic George Romero movies, no one's really super worried about money, because money, you can't buy stuff anymore because, zombies. People are interested in things like guns, because you can kill zombies, or, well, they're already dead, so I guess you can destroy zombies. Or you could go like, post-apocalyptic in the sense of like the classic, Mad Max or, Fallout type of deal. And of course in those scenarios, like in Mad Max, the latest one, Fury Road, people aren't really worried about stacks of cash, they're worried about water. Because if the civilization goes, it's just paper. It doesn't have value anymore. And again, things like diamonds and gold and so forth, even though, if you follow the economic collapse, people are saying, get gold. But of course, gold is only worth something because people value it. People aren't obligated. If you have gold, people don't say, oh crap, he's got gold, you gotta give him, stuff. We just accept it as currency. So people just say, nope, I don't value gold, there's no value to them. So extrinsic is easy. These are things that are means to an end. Food, medicine, gold, money. They're also things that we value, and they get their value from us valuing them. Again, examples would be the same. Money, diamonds, etc. So either we have a use for them that gives them value, or we just put a value upon them. The second type is intrinsic value. This one's far more controversial, because here's the idea. Intrinsic value means it's worth something in and of itself. That it's not valuable because we value it, it's not valuable as a means to an end, although it could have those values as well, But intrinsic value itself means it is worth something in and of itself. No matter what we think or feel about it, it just has worth. We have to acknowledge its value or be wrong. This is tougher, of course. Trying to find things that are just valuable in themselves, where we are obligated to recognize the value, and if we don't, we would be mistaken. Now, people have put forth various things. For example, in our own case, do people typically see themselves as things, means to ends, or do people like to think of themselves as having intrinsic worth, as being valuable because they are a person? Well, probably the second. People generally like to think of themselves as having worth. And some people are pretty, generous, or I guess kind about it. They're willing to extend that to everybody and say that people are not things, they have worth. Not as means to an end, not as things to be used, not as things to be exploited, but simply as being people. Some people also take things like love, friendship, to have intrinsic value. That friendship is not valuable because you can use your friends to make connections and get a job or pull some political favors, but it is just something that is inherently good. And that's a very important question. Are there some things that are just have worth, that we are obligated to recognize their value, even if they're not useful to us, even if they're not a means to an end? And again, things that typically fall here would be people who often see themselves that way, and people who are, I guess, kind and decent people extend that to others, but also includes things like the value of friendship, love, and some people even include things like aesthetic value, that there's like a beauty in things that gives them worth. This one, of course, extrinsic, super easy. Value because we value it. So recap, basically 4 concepts for value. Positive value has got worth. And we put that in terms of, like, in ethics as good or righteous. In terms of economics, we look at it as a profit, a gain. Negative value is something that is the opposite. In terms of morality, we talk about evil. In terms of art, we talk about things being ugly or repulsive. Or in the case of money, a loss. And then the 2 flavors of, the second 2 flavors, intrinsic means valuable in and of itself. Its value does not depend on the use to which it is put, or its value does not depend on the value we place on it, it simply has worth. So, very controversial. Extrinsic value is something that is valuable because we value it. It is a means to an end. Before pressing on, anything about positive or negative, intrinsic or extrinsic, that needs more stuff. We now turn to the dreaded spectrum of morality. Interestingly, or boringly enough, any moral theory you got, unless it's like really, really super weird, can fit somewhere in this spectrum. Now, a good question, as with any spectrum, is, so what does its spectrum define, to make up a word? Well, the idea is basically, it's addressing this question. Suppose you take a moral claim, like murder is evil, or GMOs are morally acceptable. One core question is there an answer to that that is, true? Is it an objective answer possible or not? So it deals with basically the question of, when you're talking about ethics and they make claims in it, what is their sort of foundation? And going through these will illustrate that and hopefully clarify that a bit. Now, on one extreme, we have absolutism. If you're an absolutist, you believe the following stuff. First, morality is objective. What does that mean? Well, something is objective means that it's true or false, regardless of what we think, believe about it. It's a feature of reality. For the most part, we accept things like, gravity, mass and density as being objective things. It doesn't matter what you think about gravity. If you fall off like a really big thing, like a mountain, it doesn't matter what you think about gravity. Gravity truly does not care. So it's a feature of reality. You can get it right or wrong. So with the moral absolutist, they believe morality is objective. So if killing is wrong, that's kind of like saying that an object weighs 15 kilograms. It's either true or false. It's describing real qualities. The second thing about absolutism is that it's absolute. Unlike, well, kind of like the vodka, but with a different spelling. But the idea of an absolutism is this. Moral absolutism means that for every moral problem, there's one and only one correct solution. And most importantly, there are no exceptions. So if something is wrong, it's always wrong no matter what. If something is right, it's always right no matter what. Hence, absolutism. Now the appeal of this is that it's absolute. Reality is sharply divided between good and evil. And there are no exceptions. There's just, this is good, this is bad, no exceptions. Now, one reason why people don't like it is because there are no exceptions. And intuitively, we often want to think that there are exceptions. I mean, take for example, something like lying. Most people believe most of the time that lying is wrong. Especially if people are lying to us. We generally agree that's totally wrong. But most people are willing to accept that lying is sometimes okay. And the usual examples people use, are, they seem pretty clear cases. To use a historical example, suppose, you're in France, the late 1930s, early 1940s, and the Nazis, there's like Gestapo comes to your house and knock and say, do you have any Jewish people here? And suppose you've got like 6 Jewish children in your basement, and you say no. Most people would probably say intuitively, lying to Nazis is okay, because they are Nazis. Similarly, in the United States, people tell children about Santa Claus, about the Easter Bunny. And people get presents. They're like, hey, Santa is here. And of course, that's a lie. Wish it was true, of course. Santa's pretty cool. But it's a lie. But we don't think that people are evil because they lie to their kids and then buy them presents, because Santa and presents. And of course, we also tell lies like when people ask how they look, or if someone, or take like, going back to children, the kid draws something, and they say, look, Daddy or Mommy, and the parents say, that's wonderful. It's really not wonderful. I mean, yes, it is to them, because everything's wonderful. One is a new parent, I suppose. They say it looks great, but of course they're lying to their kids. But we don't think that parents are evil because they, say nice things to their children. So they'd probably say, yeah, lying is generally bad, but there are cases where lying is okay. So if you accept the objectivism, that morality describes reality, but you don't like the absolutism, you want exceptions, you could accept what's called objectivism. And the mark of this is, if you're an objectivist, you believe that morality is objective. Moral claims are correct or incorrect, regardless of how we kind of think or feel about them, but exceptions are allowed. So you could have, lying is wrong, but exceptions are permissible. So that's kind of the appeal. It allows you to keep the objectivity, but allows you some objectivity. So you can tell children that Santa Claus is totally real. Now, for some people, objectivism is implausible. One reason why, of course, if you travel around the world in the 7 seas, or even just like in your neighborhood, you probably notice that people have different moral views. If you ask people what they think about genetically modified, organisms, some people will say, give me some of that mutant corn. I want a corn that can walk under the plate, butter itself, and then hop in my mouth. Other people say, oh, this stuff is horrible. It's gonna kill us all, just like Google. Or if you have questions, things about the Patriot Act, domestic spying. Some people believe in privacy. Others take the view privacy doesn't matter when you're dead. ISIS will kill us all. Perhaps with GMOs. Now, looking at that, people see there's so much moral disagreement. Some people say, well, this idea of objective morality has no plausibility. So what they embrace is moral relativism. Now, we saw relativism earlier. It's the idea that truth is not objective, or at least certain truths, but they're relative to something, In the case of ethics, it's typically called cultural, ethical, or moral relativism. That what's good or bad depends on your culture. Like I mentioned before, everyone's heard the saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans. It's a view that when in Rome, the Romans are right because Rome belongs to them. And the illustration I used before still holds. Imagine, if you will, you have two states. They have a road. And you're on the road, driving along, and you're going 65. And the speed limit here is 65. You're driving perfectly legal. But if over here the speed limit is 55, nothing about you, your car has changed, but now you're in another state. And so now you're driving illegally because the speed limit is different. Similarly, you can do it with any sorts of laws. Some states have laws that make fireworks legal. So if you had a car full of fireworks in one, excuse me, in one state, perfectly fine. Cross the border, now you're committing a crime. Similarly for other stuff like, well, the laws now regarding marijuana are piecemeal across the country. Some places legalized, still though federal controlled substance, so still technically illegal. But depending on where you are, the laws do change. Now, how does this connect to moral relativity? Well, here's the idea. If you're a moral relativist, you believe that morality works very much like the law. So whatever is legal or illegal depends on where you are. And the same thing can be legal or legal in different places. For the moral relativist, morality works that way. So suppose you have two cultures. And in one culture, it's morally acceptable for a woman to drive, to vote, have full, human rights. But in this other repressive culture, it's got like a lot of oil, they don't allow women to drive, they don't have full rights, etc. Not allowed to vote. So if a woman is driving, and maybe voting on her phone while she's driving, then when she's in country A, it's totally fine, because their moral system is, that's totally cool. But as soon as she hits the border, she's entered a new moral dimension. Now, she's acting immorally, acting wrongly, because here, women are not permitted to drive morally, legally and morally, and so now she is acting criminally and immorally. But if she dips back across the border, she's acting okay. Now again, this is appealing to people because, again, you travel the world in the 7 seas, and you notice that people have very differing moralities. If you go to, like, Saudi Arabia, the way they regard, the status of women, very different than the United States. And if you go to, different states in the U.S., different moral views. So it's got a certain appeal. Now for some, relativism is not good enough. Why? Well, as you travel the world in the 7 seas, you might notice that your compatriots, people who are traveling with you, also have views differing from you. And even if you stay in your own, town or city or classroom and you talk to people, you'll find disagreement, even within the same culture. And so, what people do who notice that say, well, defining a culture is really difficult. Even within the culture, there's quite a bit of disagreement. For example, if you take the United States, a person can be a member of many cultures. A person could be a Republican, Catholic, Union member, and in the United States. So they would have one set of views. A person could be, a Catholic Democrat living in the U.S. And so they belong to many cultures. And so, even within the culture, doesn't seem to be one set morality. So what the subjectivist does is say, well, relativism is too confining and intuitively doesn't seem to work. Because if you talk to 10 people, you'll probably get 10 different opinions on moral issues. So what they propose is subjectivism. This is the view that morality depends not on the culture, but on the individual. So each of us gets to set our own morality. To use a crafty analogy, relativism is kind of like the view that what counts as good food depends, or say beauty, for example. Everyone's heard familiar with the idea that like beauty varies from culture to culture, food varies from culture to culture. So relativist is kind of like that, the view that what counts as, say, good food will be set by your culture. But of course, objectivists would point out, using my crappy analogy, that individuals within a culture disagree about what is beautiful and disagree about what counts as good food. Likewise, they disagree about what's good and bad. So what you need to do is make morality like a taste in food. If Rocky Road is your favorite ice cream, it's your favorite. You like it. If someone else doesn't like it, they don't. There's no objective, fact to the matter. So, subjectivism is a view that morality depends on the individual. Essentially, what's good or bad depends on you. Now, one problem with that critics point out is this. Morality is supposed to kind of like set limits on our behavior. But if we can kind of have all of our own morality, that would be, going back to my law analogy, that'd be like being able to pass your own laws. You just make whatever law you want. If everyone can make their own laws, then law is effectively meaningless. Because you just make, if you can use a concrete example, if people just can make their own speed limits, you just say, I can't drive 55, so I want to go 150 through a school zone backwards, with my eyes closed, you just make it a law. And so in that case, law would be effectively meaningless. Likewise for morality. If morality is all subjective, it in effect becomes meaningless. Our last two are these. Now suppose someone looks at all these options and says, yeah, this is all just, essentially make-believe. There's no fact to it. Well, what you could be is what's called a moral nihilist. Now, a moral nihilist doesn't want to go around annihilating moral people, but their view is this. Roughly put, if you're talking to a moral nihilist and say, you ask them, are there books on ethics and stuff? They say, sure. Do people talk about, say words like good and evil, right and wrong? They say, sure. But they would say that those words refer to nothing. To use a crappy analogy, you could use the example of an atheist. Being a moral nihilist is kind of like the SAT questions. Being a moral nihilist is to ethics what being an atheist is to religion. So if you ask an atheist, are there churches and mosques and synagogues? They say sure. If you ask an atheist, do people talk about God and Muhammad and Jesus and so forth? They'd say sure. But they'd say they're talking about nothing. It's like talking about unicorns and dragons. You got words for it, but it talks about nothing. So the moral nihilist says there is nothing to morality. We say the words, but they refer to nothing. So those are the parts of the spectrum. One absolute view, objective, no exceptions. Morality is objective, does not depend on what we think or feel about it, but it allows exceptions. Morality depends on the culture. When in Rome, the Romans are right. Morality depends on you. You're always right. How cool is that? And it's talking about nothing. Now the last one is not really part of the spectrum, it's kind of off to the side. The moral skeptic is, of course, a skeptic. So his or her view is, they don't know. And it's a safe position because you just simply say, I don't know. So the moral skeptic is not an absolutist, objectivist, relativist, subjectivist, and nihilist. They say they don't know. And that pretty much covers all the options. One true absolute view, down to is talking about nothing, to don't know. And any moral theory you get goes somewhere in there. Conveniently enough. So that's the dreaded spectrum of morality. Now you can also, with a little tweaking and a few mods, maybe a little spray painting, you can turn this to a spectrum of aesthetics, as we'll see. Because you can have aesthetic absolutism, aesthetic relativism. You can also do with law. There are those who believe that law is objective. There are those, of course, who tend to believe it's relative. So that's the dreaded spectrum. Before moving away from the spectrum, anything about the spectrum that needs more spectral stuff. Now another way to sort of get a handle on ethics is kind of like getting a better understanding of other people. Namely, one way to figure out what a person is like, or help understand what they're like, is to get to know like their relatives. You know, knowing their family, in many cases, helps you know more about them. Or getting to know their parents tells you what they're probably going to turn into. Possible. Now, when looking at these areas, there's the following kind of stats for them. No method, just kind of qualities. One is pretty easy. What kind of terms do they use for positive value and negative value? Second question is much tougher, namely the basis, the foundation. Then, since normative errors are all about judging, and what's judging without punishments and rewards, there's the punishment and reward factor. Now with ethics, if we plug that into our template thingy, the terms are easy. Positive value is good, negative value is evil or bad, or whatever terms we have for good and bad. Now the basis though is, well, it all depends on who you're talking to. Because as we saw, with the spectrum, there's all kinds of different answers. And for every moral theory, they pretty much give a different basis. For example, some people like to base their ethics on religion. So the basis would be their religion. Some people base it on human nature. Some people base it on metaphysical principles. And so, in terms of the answer, what is ethics based on? The answer to that question is, it all depends on what theory you're talking about. Now, it'd be cool if we had a definite answer there. So we could say, yeah, here's the one true view, problem solved, it's good or evil. But for every theory, there's a different foundation. What about punishments and rewards? Well, again, that varies quite a bit. Some moral systems built in sort of a auto-punish, auto-reward system. For example, Plato, our good dead friend, believed that being evil, in a way, was kind of self-punishing. That people would become miserable and unhappy and go insane. Kind of the, almost kind of like a karma thing. Everyone's probably familiar with karma. You do stuff and you rack up bad karma, and then bad stuff happens to you. When you rack up good karma, then hopefully good stuff. Other people put it on society, that people who are bad might get punished by other people. Or they might get rewarded for being good. But again, it all depends on what theory you're talking about. So we've got the terms are easy, but everything else is up for debate. Now, a very close cousin of ethics is, of course, religion. And religion is a value, a normative area, because it tells us what makes normative areas normative is they involve judgment and value, and they're prescriptive. They tell us what we should do and what we shouldn't do. Now, religious terms are easy. Stuff you're not supposed to do is typically called sin. I know religions do vary in particular terms. And doing what one is supposed to do makes one holy, pious, righteous, etc., godly. So that's pretty easy. Basis is a bit more difficult. If someone believes, for example, people who believed in Zeus would say the basis is Zeus. Or people who believed in Quetzalcoatl, the basis would be Quetzalcoatl. People who believe in Buddhism would say the basis is Buddha. People who believe in Christianity would say the basis is God. People who are atheists would say, well, the basis is might be psychological needs and social construction. So it all depends on who you ask. Again, people who believe would base it on their particular deity or deities. People who don't would probably say this is all made up. Punishments and rewards. Well, again, it depends on what system you're talking about. Most religions, but not all, have punishments and rewards. Most common, hell and heaven. Some, have things like nirvana as kind of a reward. Now again, that all depends on, which religion is correct. And one problem we're into is, well, we all know which religion is correct. Everyone says, if you ask someone which religion is correct, they say, my religion. But everyone says that, and most people have different religions. So, unfortunately, we don't have a definitive answer to this, except everyone thinks that they do. But not everyone can be right, but everyone can be wrong. Now, religion and ethics do kind of hang out. As I mentioned, one common type of ethics is what's called religious-based ethics, where people base their morality on religion. And in fact, there's a theory called divine command theory, that what makes things good is that God commands. He says, this is what you do. It's good because he says so. And things are bad because he forbids them. It's kind of a souped-up version of parental command theory. When parents say, why? Because I say so, they're doing parental command theory. Now, interestingly, boringly enough, there are people who criticize religion on ethical grounds. For example, there's some very famous atheists who write books and appear on radio shows talking smack about religion and talking about how smart they are. And one of their kind of standard arguments is that religion is really, really dangerous and leads people to do all kinds of crazy, dangerous stuff and hurt people, terrorism, etc., and bingo and so forth. And so they argue is that religion is actually immoral. It's wrong. So they use ethics to sort of try to attack religion. And so the two are closely related. Again, many people base their ethics on religion, and there are those who try to attack religion on the basis of ethics. Usually those famous atheists people. They have a book they want you to buy. But don't buy it. I guess you can buy it if you want to. As with all things. Now, the third area is, of course, law. Now, the terms are super easy. If you're doing what the law says you shouldn't be doing, you're doing something illegal. You're breaking the law. If you're doing what the law says you should be doing, you're acting legally. So there's legal, illegal. Now, the basis of law, well, looked at kind of on the surface, the answer is pretty easy. We make that stuff up. There are some dudes and dudettes, I think probably right now down at the Capitol, making up some crap. Is making up rules. And then saying you gotta follow these rules because we're the legislature, so do what we say. And so same with like all the laws in the books. People sat down and just made up some stuff, just wrote it out. And then they say, we'll vote on it, pow, it's the law. So that basis is pretty easy. People are just making up crap. And sometimes it is truly crap. Sometimes it's pretty good laws though. Like, don't kill people, probably a good law. Now, then the question comes up, so is there anything like beyond just making crap up that grounds the laws, that provides a foundation? Because if somebody says, if people are just making crap up, it's like a game. And I don't want to play the game, why should I just go along with crap people make up if I don't want to do that? I mean, aside from the fact, of course, that the police will shoot you and stuff, but talking theoretically. Well, some thinkers try to provide foundations for laws. One example, the great political philosopher Sarah Palin, also the great thinker Mike Huckabee, and Rockstar as well, and other thinkers take the view that you should base laws on religion. It's a classic and well-established intellectual position that the laws of God should be the laws of humans. And this is something that's supported in Christian thought, Islamic scholarship, ISIS, for example. That's their professed view, that the laws of the state should be the laws of God. Many conservative American politicians also have a similar view. I mean, they don't want Islam, obviously in the United States, but they want to have a religious-based law, the idea that it should be grounded on religious thought. Now, one of the problems, of course, of basing laws on religion is you got to find out the correct religion. And if you ask anybody, they always say that they're correct. But we have a lot of people saying different things, so there's a practical problem of finding out which among the billions of us has got it completely right, that we should listen to because they know exactly what God wants and what God's up to. Now, another basis for laws, interestingly, boringly enough, is ethics. People often want to base, the legality of stuff based on their morality or immorality. Now, with some stuff that seems to work kind of reasonable. For example, murdering people is bad, and so we make it illegal because we don't want people doing that stuff. But there are probably a lot of things that are immoral that we don't want people to be like arrested for. For example, cheating at Monopoly, probably immoral. But should that be a criminal offense? No. I mean, it's kind of a jerky thing to do to cheat at a board game, and clearly wrong, but not really a subject to the police. Similarly, I guess, so, a person, having an affair when they're, have a girlfriend or boyfriend. Well, we'd say that's wrong to do, but we don't think that should be a law. Interestingly, most states still have laws against adultery. It's a Class B misdemeanor. Also, prostitution. See, a prostitute also a Class B misdemeanor. The reason I know that is because of the guy in New York, Elliot Spitzer, I believe his name was, who was committing adultery with a prostitute. So double Class B misdemeanors. Never charged though. Just lost his job and was humiliated, and then eventually got a show on CNN, which I think is probably the worst punishment of all. And then he doesn't do that anymore, but he's still super rich, so I guess win, kind of. Now, so there's some things we regard as immoral we don't want to be illegal, and there are some things that are illegal that aren't immoral. For example, you could take, if you're parked at a meter, and the meter, you can't get the meter in time it runs out. You're now parked illegally, but you're probably not parked immorally. You're not a bad person because you couldn't get to your meter. And of course, there's tons of laws in the books that have nothing to do with morality, and we also want to say that there are some laws that are on the books that are actually immoral. They're evil and bad laws. And history, of course, is full of those types of laws. And we hopefully try to get rid of them. Next thing, next two things. Another normative area is etiquette. Before moving to etiquette. Interestingly, oddly enough, there is a moral view called legal positivism, sometimes known as legalism, which was, it's called legalism by the Chinese thinkers who are called, in English, legalist. And they tried to solve the whole ethics problem this way. Whatever the law says is good, because the law says so. Whatever is legal is bad because the law says so. And that kind of solves the problem. If you don't know what's good and bad, you just look at the law. But kind of the obvious problem with that is we do intuitively think there can be bad laws. That if someone just writes down something like murder is okay, we'd say, well, that's probably still wrong, even if it was on the books as a law. Etiquette. In terms of the terms, positive thing would be like well-mannered, cultured, polite. On the negative value would be like rude, impolite, uncultured. Basis of etiquette, well, this one's super easy. We just make that crap up totally. Things like which fork to use. Totally made up. I mean, there's some practicality in terms of I guess the functionality of the forks and stuff, but totally made up. So all aspects of etiquette are pretty much made up. We make up those rules. And of course they change. That's why, if you're older people are always so grumpy about stuff, it's because one reason is the rules of etiquette change. And people talk about kids today are so rude. It's like, no, they just have a different sense of etiquette. Just like when people that are saying that were kids, their elders said, kids today are so rude. Because the kids today are always rude going back to the beginning of humanity. Because etiquette changes. People have different values. And part is different technology. To use an obvious example, when I was in college, there were no, smartphones. So there was no smartphone etiquette. You couldn't bring a phone. I guess you could bring a phone to class if you ran a line to the classroom and were talking on it. But, but now everyone's got a smartphone. There's a whole different etiquette. So you'll hear grumpy people my age complaining about people just staring at their phones. The person goes out on a date, they're staring at their phone, they're Facebooking. And that's so rude. But of course, the cultural thing today is the phone is the most important thing in the universe. So always look at the phone. Because if you're not looking at it, it could vanish, because to be is to be perceived. But anyway, so etiquette changes. We totally make that crap up. So when you hear older people complaining about stuff, you can tell them etiquette is entirely make-believe. But, that said, we could provide some connection to, say, ethics. Namely that, even though the rules of etiquette do change, there still may be a moral thing where you're supposed to show respect to people, however that respect may be. And it does change over time, what is considered, proper behavior, proper dress, etc. But we could say there's a moral sort of a moral requirement to whatever those things are to be blunt. Now, in terms of the punishments and rewards, well, that can vary quite a bit. For example, a person might be stared at, sort of like, oh, what a rude person. Or the reward might be, oh, what a polite young person. How refreshing. But in other cases, of course, to use a sort of a concrete thing, there can be, not surprisingly, serious consequences. For example, if anybody's going to do like a job interview, one thing that's always good to know is what is the current etiquette about job interviews? How are you supposed to dress? What is, most jobs, the traditional is to go in a three-piece suit. If you're in a tech company, maybe the way they interview is you go in with like jeans and like some sort of ironic t-shirt. Being on time, not being on time. And the reason why those can be important is because, again, potential consequences. Give one concrete example. Years and years ago, one of the professors I knew told me this story about their interview of a candidate for a job. And the candidate did well in the interview, did like, taught like a, sample class, did like a presentation, and it was all over except for signing the contract. And so they took the person to dinner. And they're like, okay, we're gonna hire this person, problem solved. And then during dinner, the person reached out and just grabbed a whole stick of butter in his hand and just started chewing on it like a candy bar. And the person did not get the job. Even though, of course, that's totally irrelevant to their competence as a professor, that is, of course, rude. You can't have someone who just eats butter like that in one's department. And I've heard of similar things. Like there was another case, again, not anything involving me, but there was a person who went through the job interview process, all but hired. They go to the chair's house for dinner, and the chair had made like his famous meat chili, and the person looked at it and said, "I don't eat meat, and I'm a vegan." And of course, people are vegans, but that was insulting to the chair, so no job for them. So it can have serious consequences, because sometimes people take their meat chili very seriously. So as a kind of useful tip, if you're going in for a job interview, always find out like what is the current etiquette in business, etc. And similarly for professionalism. Even though etiquette is all just crap that's made up, people take that stuff really seriously. And generally pants are not optional in most jobs, interestingly enough. Last of the areas, aesthetics. Terms are easy. Beauty, ugliness, sublime, crappy. All the things we use to assess, films, movies, books, people, etc., in terms of their appearances. Now the basis is, well, much like ethics, big question mark. If you're Plato, like we saw, you believe that beauty is a form. So things are grounded, their ugliness or beauty, grounded in metaphysics. So you say that that is beautiful or that's ugly, you're saying something that can be correct or incorrect. Everyone, of course, has heard the expression that beauty is now the beholder, or beer holder, depending on what you're talking about. And in that case, the basis would just be how you kind of presumably feel about it, the art. So the basis is wide open, depending on who you talk to. There are those who think that beauty is, like Plato, a feature of the world. Those who think it's all a matter of like how you kind of feel about it. Punishments and rewards. Well, interestingly, morally enough, these can vary quite a bit. For example, on sort of the reward side, if you created a work of art that is extremely popular, let's say something like Avengers: Age of Ultron, or you're like Picasso, the reward could be millions of dollars. So big rewards. Punishments, well, it could be things like if something's really awful, people like making fun of someone, or in some cases, if someone violates like cultural taboos, etc. in creating works of art, could be up to including death. Interesting, morally enough, ethics, religion, and law, and aesthetics all interact. For example, there are, of course, laws governing aesthetics. To use a very obvious example, everyone's probably, listened to the radio or, watched TV and heard, bleeping and blooping. And that's by the law. By law, there's things you can't say on television. Well, I was going to say non-cable TV, but all TV is pretty much cable TV today. But they have that distinction between, different types of channels. So you can swear as much as you want on HBO because it's not TV. Apparently it's swear TV. But on, other stations you can't. But that's a place where law impacts aesthetics. Similarly, religion and aesthetics. You might have heard of the case where at Charlie Hebdo, people went in and just shot up those cartoonists because they were creating works of art, cartoons, mocking the Prophet Muhammad, which is kind of a violation of religious views. Also, of course, ethics affects aesthetics.
Is that why the door's open? I don't think it's gonna stay.
Thank you. I don't think that helps at all, but psychologically it makes me feel a little better. I think maybe there's a little cool breeze. Feel it. I think I feel it. Actually, I don't. I'm lying to myself. That's terrible. Oh, good. At least someone feels it. Ethics and aesthetics. Yeah, there could be, take a concrete example. Years ago, when I was in grad school, centuries ago, there was something got in the paper. A art student, had gone and decided he was going to create a cutting-edge work of art. So he went down to the pet store and bought a bunch of those little white mice they feed to boa constrictors. And then he got a bunch of acrylic plastic. He put the mice in like a cooking pan, like a brownie pan, heated up the acrylic, and then poured it over the mice. As you might imagine, that was pretty fatal. And then he cut the acrylic up into sections, and the mice were like frozen like Han Solo in carbonate, except they were totally dead and looking probably pretty horrified. And what the student said was that was art. And of course, the ASPCA and others went nuts, saying, that's illegal, violates cruelty to animals, saying it's immoral because, it's torturing these poor little mice. And the person's defense was, well, one was, it is art, exempt from the rules of morality. And their legal defense was, well, these things are sold to be dropped down into the tummy of a boa constrictor. So that's already, if we can take a mouse and throw it into a snake, which is probably pretty horrifying for the mouse, then pouring hot acrylic on them is probably not any worse. Which is a good point. Being consumed alive and being digested over the course of several hours, or a quick death with acrylic. Tough choice. Hopefully not an option one has to ever pick between. Snake, acrylic, or acrylic snake. Okay, so that takes us through the areas and how they kind of hang out with each other. Before pressing on, anything about that stuff that needs more stuff? Or anything about acrylic or snakes? Picked up a lot of stuff on the Discovery Channel about snakes. Now, people have been cranking out moral theories since a really long time, even before our good dead friend Socrates. And so not surprisingly, there's a whole bunch of different versions. And here are some, this way if you ever play like a Jeopardy game or Trivial Pursuit about ethical categories, you'll have some of this stuff. Now one very popular one, which goes way, way back, at least to our good dead friend Socrates, and was definitely put forth by our good dead friend Aristotle, is what's called virtue theory, sometimes called eretaic, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, but the idea is pretty straightforward. For virtue theory, what you should do is develop your virtues to become a good person. And Aristotle is kind of our prime example of that in his famous work, the Nicomachean Ethics. Another one is what's called, with the exciting name of cognitivism. It's the view, basically it's an objective view of morality. That moral claims are true or false, and so we're not just making that stuff up. We saw cultural relativism, the idea that morality depends on your culture. When in Rome, the Romans are right. We also saw divine command theory. Things are bad because God says they're bad, or good because God says they're good. One of the views to look at is pretty mainstream, It goes by the name deontology. From the Greek deon, meaning duty. Not like howdy doody or doggy duty, but duty as in obligation. And one of the forms of deontology, kind of the standard form, is the view that morality is based on laws. So what is right is to follow the correct laws, and what is wrong is to break those laws. So if a deontologist drove a car, their bumper sticker would say, well, like the shirt says, it would say, obey, obey the rules. So a very deontologist shirt there. A good visual aid for the course. Another view that also has a long pedigree is what's called ethical egoism. Now, everyone's probably heard about people who are egotists, and someone who's an egotist thinks they're the greatest thing since, well, anything. They think they're really awesome. They have a really high self-opinion. Now, egoism by itself is kind of just straight up selfishness. Ethical egoism, though, goes beyond just being straight up selfish. It's selfishness with a theory. So, crunch down a bit, ethical egoism is the view that what you and what I should do is what maximizes my self-interest. Crudely put, what is good is what is best for me. Now, the reason why it's a moral theory and not just selfishness is this. If I'm just selfish, all I care about is myself. I don't have a theory, I'm just selfish. But if I have a moral theory of ethical egoism, I think that I should do what's best for myself, act in my own self-interest, but since I've got a moral theory, I think everyone else should too. So we should all be acting in our self-interest. Why is this view important? One reason it's important is if you follow politics at all, you might have heard of like, the Tea Party, and one of their sort of patron philosophical saints is Ayn Rand, famous philosopher, and dead, but famous. And she put forth a view called the virtue of selfishness. And she argued for this, that what everyone should do is not be altruistic, not look out for others, but look out for yourself. And so the idea basically is, by acting in your own self-interest, things will be best for you. Now most people, like people in politics, you're not going to see someone get up on the stage and say, everyone be just total selfish bastards, because that probably would play terribly well in the general populace. But they'll present, essentially ethical egoism. Everyone should act out in their own self-interest. And that's kind of the view endorsed by the folks in the Tea Party, or some of them at least. So it's a moral view laid out by Tommy Hobbes, a good dead friend, also on Rand, and many thinkers consider it to be sort of the philosophical underpinning of a certain part of the conservative movement. Now we also saw ethical relativism, the idea that morality depends on the culture. Getting into some esoteric theories, one is called emotivism. This is the view that morality, shockingly enough, is a matter of emotions. So when I say capital punishment is bad, what I'm really saying is capital punishment, yucky. Or if I say that GMOs are good, I'm saying GMOs, yay. So the idea is basically for the emotivist is that moral judgments essentially express our emotional reactions to stuff. So we say that something is good, we're expressing a positive view, I feel good about it. And if something is bad, I'm expressing a negative view, I feel bad about that. This is opposed to cognitivism, which believes that morality, it's kind of the exact opposite. The belief that morality is about, cognitive stuff. Now one that's a real crowd pleaser, literally, is what's called hedonism. You might have heard of this, this is a common phrase. Hedonism, someone is hedonistic, means that what they do is they seek their pleasure. They try to live a life of pleasure. So a hedonist is someone who lives to enjoy life. It's not a moral view. Just like, with ethical egoism, it's actually a moral theory. The idea is that people should act in their own self-interest, and people who are trying to sell ethical egoism say this is better for everyone. Sort of the classic argument for laissez-faire capitalism from Adam Smith is that if we all act in our best interest, we compete, it'll be better for everybody. Classic capitalism 101. Hedonism, again, is not a moral view. It's a view that if someone's a hedonist, what they do is they act in accord with what gives them pleasure. Now, of course, there is a moral view. You could have like ethical hedonism, in which what you should do is try to maximize your pleasure. Another kind of esoteric view is what's called intuitionism. Now, when philosophers talk about ethics, they often talk about, make appeals to intuitions. They'll say things like, intuitively, murdering people for fun is wrong. And so some philosophers said, well, if people are using all these appeals to intuition, let's just go for it. So intuitionism is the view that our moral intuitions provide the moral truths for us, that intuitively we intuit the good and the evil. Now, of course, the problem is that intuitions are kind of like, highs. Pretty much everyone's got them, and they all tend to be kind of different. Another kind of esoteric thing is moral anti-realism versus realism. Back in the ancient days of like yesterday and the day before, we talked about realism when it comes to universals, to believe they are really real for real. Now, if you're a moral realist, you believe there really are for real moral properties. To use a crappy analogy, we tend to believe that properties like mass, density, volume are real. They're not just like made up. It's not how we feel about stuff. If you're a moral realist, you'd believe that if you're making a list of the ingredients in the world, there'd be moral properties in there, good and evil. If you ever play video games that have like a strong moral component, some of them actually they're pretty clear examples of moral realism, where good and evil are parts of the world. Like for example, the classic Neverwinter Nights games, you could have holy weapons that are good weapons that damage evil creatures more. Or you could have unholy weapons that damage good creatures more, because in that universe, that game reality, good and evil are real things. You can detect them. Creatures can be damaged by sort of the opposing weapons, holy, unholy, etc. Now, if you're an anti-realist, your view is that there aren't moral properties. They're not. You can still believe in morality. You just don't think that good and evil are out there in the world. They're not qualities of things. And again, that's kind of a metaphysical debate. We also looked at moral skepticism, briefly. That's just skepticism about ethics, saying the no. Naturalism is also popular. The idea basically that morality is based on features of the natural world. Aquinas based some of his morality on that, so did Aristotle. There's also prescriptivism, which pretty much is, what it says is that when you make moral claims, we're basically saying, I approve of this, you should do this too. So if I say generosity is good, I'm saying I approve of generosity, you should do that too. Or if I say that killing is wrong, I'm essentially saying I disapprove of killing, you shouldn't do that. We saw subjectivism already, the idea that morality depends on the individual. And lastly, there's teleology, which comes from the Greek teleos, meaning end or goal. And these are moral systems that are focused on typically the consequences for the most part. So the idea is that when you're assessing things morally, you look at the result. And we'll see when we talk about utilitarianism, we'll take a look at that. So those are some very briefly, very briefly, some of the moral theories. Now, there's many more. Like I said, people have been cranking out these theories for thousands of years, and they just keep writing more. In fact, probably someone's making moral theory right now. Now, the first one we'll look at, and we'll get to the introduction today, and then that'll be that for today, is a very appealing classical moral theory called utilitarianism. If you ever need to get into a moral debate, or get into moral debate, this is actually a pretty good approach. Here's the idea. Utilitarianism, generically, is the view that what you should do, because it's trying to tell us, morality, what should we be doing, what shouldn't we be doing, is that the action that is good is the one that creates the most utility for the morally relevant beings. Now, put generically, if a utilitarian was driving a car, their bumper sticker might say something like, the greatest good for the greatest number. Or if they're Star Trek fans, it would say, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. Now, what a utilitarian has to do, of course, is answer the two questions. Well, more questions, but two main are this. One is, what's utility? And the second is, what's a relevant being? Here's the answer. Utility for the utilitarian is a fancy term for value. So the answer to the question is, well, the question is, what is of value? And the answer provides that. Some common answers have been pleasure, of positive value, pain as being negative value, happiness is positive value, unhappiness is negative value, desire satisfaction is positive value, desire thwarting as negative value, and you could put pretty much, or you could go like economic and put in like, money, making lots of money, positive value, losing money, negative value. Now the second thing they got to address is the question of who is relevant, who counts. And this could range from just like nothing, no one counts, to all the way to everyone. And they're, depending on what utilitarian you talk to, they have varying degrees in which the scope of morality, in terms of who counts, gets extended. To do a kind of a quick illustration of both of these, suppose someone caches out value in terms of like happiness and unhappiness. So they would say actions are good when they create more happiness than unhappiness. Then of course they have to answer the question, for who? Who does happiness do we consider? Now, some utilitarians include like all human beings. Some, as we'll see, are pretty generous. They include all things that feel pleasure and pain. So to give a kind of concrete illustration, people disagree about whether, say, animals count. Some people do. They want to make animals count morally. So things like chickens and pigs and cats and dogs and kiwis, the bird, not the fruit, would count. And people who are concerned about animal rights or animal treatment are often utilitarians, and they consider animals to be relevant beings. So the suffering of a chicken would matter to them. Now typically they do have like, kind of a scale of value. So a chicken doesn't count as much as a human, and like a mouse doesn't count as much as like a dog, but they would have some value, more than nothing. And of course there's some people who consider animals to have no value whatsoever, except in terms of their deliciousness, or lack thereof. Now historically, there's been a split between utilitarians on one major issue, namely this. It's called act versus rule. And we'll see when we get to the problems of utilitarianism next time, why they have that division. But roughly put, here's the idea. If you're an act utilitarian, what you do is you assess each action in a way kind of in isolation. You just say, if I do this, what will be the consequence of that particular action? Now, as we'll see when we get to the end of utilitarianism, that can create some problems. Because there are some things that, if you do them, they would seem to have like positive consequences, but if you did them like a lot, they would have like really negative consequences. And we'll see those next time. Now the rule utilitarian says, what you do is you pick the action that, if it was made into a rule that people would follow, would create the most utility. So the idea is basically like, if I do this right now, would it create more happiness than happiness? And I'll use a stupid illustration. Let's say a person is there like with cake, and they look at the cake and say, if I have cake now, will that create more happiness than unhappiness? And they say, cake is happiness. Play the cake. Now, of course, pretty much every time you go to eat the cake would always be like more happiness than unhappiness. But of course, suppose the person has a general rule or general policy to always eat cake. Well, could that have negative consequences? They could get the diabetes, for example, or obesity, or run out of cake. And so, well, that's a crap illustration, but we could say is, well, we'd have the rule, if you look at the rule, always eat cake, then that would be a bad general rule, so you shouldn't always eat cake. But when we get to the problems of utilitarianism, we'll see some substantial ones, such as sacrificing a person to a mob in order to avoid, a massacre. Final thing, in terms of the proponents, people who like this stuff, includes a lot of people. The person we'll look at as our main example is our good dead friend John Stuart Mill, and we'll look at him next time. So why do people like this? Well, quickly, when people make decisions, and they're doing so rationally, they usually weigh cost and benefits. They do a pro-con cost and benefit analysis. Secondly, it seems to match democracy. The idea that if we're trying to do the greatest good for the greatest number, it sounds very democratic, what benefits the most people. And next time we'll pick up here, looking at the moral intuition argument.